I'm going to get into the working document space. So picture yourself as a working archivist in a private collection, public collection, big university archive, or corporate setting. You have your basic stuff down, and now you are looking to get money. You are looking to make use of the collections in place and the momentum you have as a collection to get money. So we're going to talk about this in the specific form of grant proposals, but we will also be talking more generally about things like budgets that we might use as part of project proposals in a for-profit setting, sort of justification of your existence as a cost center, or description of your holdings as a set of business assets that deliver value that might be actually harder to quantify, but is still really important. So translating, you might be entering into agreements or partnerships in the form of memorandums of understanding, partnership agreements, or contracts. You may also have if you are not a nonprofit, but you want to kind of take advantage of the availability of grant funding that does what you do, you maybe are an independent movie producer, you might take advantage of a relationship that's called fiscal sponsorship, where you borrow the nonprofit status of an established organization and kind of filter your funding through them. So they accept responsibility for making sure that you are carrying out the work that is aligned with their mission, and you are getting funding through them. They might take a little slice off the top, but this is something that happens for projects that aren't really big enough to be their own organization or nonprofit, but are aligned very closely with the mission of existing nonprofits. So there might be a memorandum of understanding between a nonprofit and an individual or entity, and a group that is working on something that is aligned with their mission. So it's a win-win situation. So you get to apply for funding from a source that you wouldn't necessarily be eligible for otherwise, and the nonprofit gets to kind of outsource work that furthers their mission. So I'm happy to point you all to resources that relate to what is a fiscal sponsorship agreement, and some examples of that. Again, the Association of Moving Image Archivists has a fiscal sponsorship option. So do organizations like the International Documentary Association. Frequently works with documentary producers who are looking for grant funding to produce documentary films. So the IDA doesn't make films themselves, but they help producers make films, and they become a sort of an accounting structure for people who might really need it because they don't have those things themselves, like a separate bank account. So, job descriptions fall into that category as well. When we're talking about grant proposals, often one of the things that's asked for is descriptions of all the people who will work on a project, and what their role will be, and where they fit into it. So the foundational documents that we talked about from Module 1, the mission statements, vision statements, collection policies, donation agreements, deposit agreements, collection guidelines, even finding aids, and basic descriptions of things in the collection. In addition to all of those, we would find for a grant project ourselves generating new things like a project description, just what do we plan to do? So where the mission statement is, who are we, what do we do, and why do we do it? The project description is, what do we want to do? It's really tactical. It's here's what we want to do. Here's how it relates to what we do. And here's how we plan to go about it. Here's what we think it's going to cost. That's the budget. And breaking down, often a budget includes a budget justification. So you have the dollars and cents in a spreadsheet. You have a justification section that's more narrative and that talks about, well, we are asking for this amount of money. Here's why we have something that's a little bit more than you might expect, or here, let me explain this line item here. A great example of that is a project that I worked on was a board member for the Association of Moving Image Archivists, where we had a Pathways Fellowship program that we were applying for funding from the IMLS, the Institute for Museum and Library Services. We were applying for IMLS funding to offer paid internships or fellowships to emerging professionals from underrepresented backgrounds in the moving image archives profession, to help them on a pathway to working in different areas of the profession. We realized that central to our goals was making this profession accessible to people who may not have had opportunities in the field before, and were, for various reasons, maybe prevented. So we understood that things like caregiving responsibilities is a diversity criterion, and that disability is a diversity criterion, and that one of the things that prevents people from undertaking things like internships or intensives is the opportunity cost of moving temporarily someplace. So we wanted to write into this grant a line item for a fairly significant chunk of money that we were calling accessibility funding, that each participant, each applicant to the Pathways Fellowship Program could make use of a portion of that funding to make this experience accessible to them. So that might be paying for childcare for the days on which they were working, or if they were going to be doing a remote internship, getting a new laptop or upgrading their home Wi-Fi service, or acquiring equipment to make a workspace more accessible if they had accommodation needs that the organization, which in many cases were small, underfunded institutions, the organization could use to make their workplace more accessible to that fellow, but also to anybody who is participating or accessing their collections down the future. So we saw this accessibility funding as something that was really necessary. It wasn't something explicitly delineated or outlined in a sample grant, but it was something we felt we could justify. So we talked a lot about the dollar value that would go into our budget, and we also talked about the justification and further, the procedures that we would want to put in place to have the participants and applicants be made aware that this funding was available, and how they would go about requesting it or making use of it, and keeping track of what was available. So that's something that where there's multiple layers of things that might fit into to a grant application that come up when you start unpacking something that sounds simple, like a budget. What's your budget? Not just how much money do you want, but what do you need it for, and getting into the dollars and cents of what things are going to cost. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next section about how things like budgets are often informed by documentation themselves. For instance, doing efficiency analyses or cost and investment return analyses on the activities that you've already done to get a better sense of how you might go about asking for money to do more things in the future. So again, this is complex and interwoven. And so most of the time, when we're talking about essential documents that you might need for grant proposals, we're talking about a set of documents, some of which you're going to be using over and over again, or tweaking in a really minor way to fit the requirements of the grant. Often grant proposal guidelines have really strict rules about word counts or page counts. So you may have, as part of your accreditation documents for an institution, institution that's part of a museum, you may have a binder full of senior staff resumes that you can use to make one-page resumes that are required for federal grants for all project personnel. And so this points to the need to, when you're at this stage of the game, to create a repository of documents, to think not only about, all right, let's create these documents, but all right, we have these documents in place. Where are we going to put them and keep them so that the people in our organization that are creating funding requests or volunteers or consultants that we might be working with have access to them going forward? You might also be thinking about version control. So starting to put headers and footers on those files and saying like, or using file names that say, this is the revised version of our mission statement, or this is the first draft of our budget, and it was created on this date, so that you have some consistency and control. This starts getting into project management stuff. So the documents that you create that are essential for a grant project are going to be dictated by the terms of the grant and the requirements for applying. They're going to be often drawn from existing documents or documentation, or based on documentation that you may have that will inform your process. And they are often an investment in your essential documents stockpile. So you might write a budget narrative for one project that you end up borrowing heavily from for another project that you're writing, or you may have last year's grant application that didn't make it, and you may want to tweak that based on the input that you get from grant reviewers. So creating that, creating files and folders and shared repositories where people who are looking for these things can go and find them, and thinking about the stakeholders and who's going to have access to those documents is part of this essential documents picture. So not just having the documents, but managing them too. So it starts to get complicated pretty fast. And let's go now to look as a group at the sample application shared by the National Archives and Records Administration. So this is a big one. It is 39 pages. I'm going to go ahead and share a version of this from the internet. This is also linked from the Archives Help Desk, which one of our participants was very kind to link in the chat. So you can follow along by yourself on this if you want to read ahead. I'm going to just call up the Help Desk. And again, this is in the funding, financial, and grants section. This is so there's a ton of great resources here. So first of all, Foundation Directory is where you can go to search by subject or geographic focus. This is an incredibly useful resource, and it has some self-paced courses. If you've never searched for or applied for a grant before, I can't recommend this tutorial enough. It's brief, basic, and really readily understandable. So we're going to look at this sample application. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this session, you almost never have to start from scratch when you're doing essential documents like a grant proposal. And one of the really most valuable things you can do, as with mission statements, looking at what do people who are like you do when they are faced with this challenge, when they have to write this. Looking at an example can be incredibly helpful. It can just convey a lot of tacit instructions about how to do what you need to do. And so let's look at this sample application and just have a browse through it. So one thing that pops out right away for me is how very formal this application is. that it is there's, specific things that you need. This federal entity identifier or federal award identifier, you might need something called a DUNS number, DUNS number, just to apply for a federal grant. So if you're going on grants.gov, and that's here in this organizational DUNS or employer taxpayer identification number. So each of these things can be found in a essential document for an archive. So for the EIN or TIN, if you're an individual, your taxpayer identification number is your social security number. If you're an employer, including a nonprofit organization that is incorporated, you will get what's called an IRS declaration letter that will have your employer identification number or your taxpayer identification number right there on it. So that is definitely, and you may also need to provide a copy of your IRS declaration letter to anybody who is making a major donation of cash or material goods. You will definitely need it as part of grant applications. So that IRS declaration letter is one of those things that kind of goes into the folder of basic documents that you don't want to be having somebody ask you for every time when they're inevitably applying for a grant at the very last minute. The organizational DUNS number is the number that's applied that kind of puts you in the federal system that enables you to apply for grants and for the federal government to track how you have received and used grant funding in the past. So right here for address, I can already see that this is going to create some challenges for some people because some organizations are organizations without walls, right? So having an address and just being able to have a place that you point things to, whether it is a board number or an agent for service of process, a place where physical mail can be sent and where somebody can be contacted, contact information. When you get into a grant writing process, you have to figure out who is going to be the person that's getting all the emails and or the phone calls and is going to be the primary point of contact. So these are not necessarily essential documents, but they are essential conversations to have and decisions to reach that you may document in some other form. So this is a funding opportunity number. So that's going to be something that you find on the website of your funder or the notice of funding opportunity and a title. Coming up with a title for a project. They give you a lot of space here, but like a mission statement, it does need to be concise. How do you create a title for a project that really conveys what you're trying to do and represents the project well to somebody who's reviewing this application? For the LA as Subject workshops, this series of workshops, the grant application for it was about preserving LA community histories. And the description really went into detail about the identified need. The Archives at Risk Committee's work to identify some key areas of need for our broader stakeholder community to share information and tools and resources to make sure that the collections that represent the history of the Los Angeles region and the communities that populate this region and have done so over time are sustainably documented. We want to strengthen networks and increase information sharing. So, how do you capture all that in just a title? So these are all getting into more details, nitty gritty. It's always a great idea to review, just like when you are cooking something in the kitchen, to read the recipe before you start cooking. Looking over the grant application is going to give you some clues about what documents you're going to need to have, if not right away, then by the time you complete the application and submit it. It's going to give you the grant application guidelines and the sample documents are going to give you a sense of how much space you have, what it's going to look like. Even things like formatting might be described with real specificity. And for grants, it's particularly important to follow the instructions. So if you are writing a grant proposal, one of the essential documents that you're going to want to capture is those grant application guidelines. If they're posted online, make sure you download them or copy that text and put it in a folder someplace that you can access later when you're not online, if you don't have internet access. If you are working on this, that's really, really important to capture. For every grant you apply for, making sure you have a record of what's required. Just like when you're job hunting, having a copy of the job description so that when days or weeks or months later somebody calls you for an interview, you can refer back to that. The same grant guidelines perform the same function. And so you can see the bulk of this grant application is narrative. This is a lot of text talking about what is supposed to happen, what the intention is of the applicant for this project. It's providing context that is maybe not necessarily reflected in public-facing documents like the website, but might be available through other means. So the statement like this: roughly 90% of GHS's holdings are presently available to researchers. Knowing things about your collection, having data and descriptive information about your collection is something I think falls under the heading of essential documents. Having a sense of collection overview or collection context is really, really important, or examples of collections that you that are highlights and that speak to those core values that this project is going to focus on. So I'm going to create another set of breakout rooms for you all to go on into and discuss for the next 5 minutes or so. This is just going to be a really brief discussion, and I'm going to create 2 breakout rooms for this. One moment. So I'm hoping by assigning you guys randomly to 2 breakout rooms, we'll have groups where people have and haven't applied for grants and can talk about their experiences. And then we're going to reconvene for just about 2 more minutes to talk about grants, samples, and the kinds of things that you might be looking for grant funding for, and how ready you feel to do that. So I'm going to open, I'm going to put us in breakout rooms. Actually, I'm just looking at the time now. I think what we'll do is stay in a big group and just to have that discussion as a group, since there are about 13 of us here. I know some of you have applied for grants before, and some of you are probably getting ready to do that or thinking about doing it. So let's talk about grant readiness. Who has, if I can warm call somebody who has applied for a grant before and somebody who has never applied for a grant, but you think you will probably be doing so in the next year. And I'd like to talk about the required documents that you already have, the stuff that you know you're going to need, but don't have ready yet, and how you think you might get there. I'm going to go ahead and share screen because this will be our activity for this segment. Great. So can I get a volunteer who has applied for a grant before? Great. And Mia, I'm going to have you be our haven't applied, but will be in the future.
Yeah, sounds good.
Putting you on notice. So Denise, have you applied for a grant before? Can I call on you?
Actually, we did through Cal Humanities. We got it, but then COVID hit and everything just stopped. It was a co-project, a collaborative project between CAM and Pepperdine.
Interesting. And what was the scope of the project?
We wanted to take or develop an oral history project of one of the Church of God in Christ, because Pepperdine somehow is very connected. And Pepperdine used to have a campus down here, down near downtown. And they're trying to make good on, God, God, I can hardly remember. This is 3 years ago.
Yeah, I
And
know, pre-pandemic. Who even remembers
pre-pandemic, and
that
we
far back?
won a $10,000 grant to capture
Wow.
histories of people who were living in this neighborhood when Pepperdine had a campus downtown.
I remember
Cool.
that, Denise. We were kind of involved with that
That's right,
too.
Keith. That's right. Yes,
Yeah,
because you were one of our experts, right? I think.
right. Yeah, me and Karen, I think, were talking to them. Yeah.
And we had the money, but it became fallow, or it just fell by the wayside.
And the
COVID.
person that was in charge of it, he moved. You
Mhm.
Yeah, he
remember?
moved. The person who helped develop the grant, he's now on the East Coast.
Right.
Yeah, this sort of thing happens quite a lot. So communications and contacts is another set of essential documents that I think are really important with grant projects, because you need to know who you're working with. You need to maintain those channels of communication, and people do leave and move on. So the idea of succession planning becomes really important with grants and grant funded projects too. You know, if the program officer you're working with goes away, who's standing in line to work with you next? That's really, really interesting. And for the grant writing project, preparing the proposal itself, Denise, did you feel that a lot of the work you were doing was original, or did you feel like you were making use of materials that existed on your website, things like the mission statement, other partners and collaborators? Talk about the process of putting those pieces together and submitting the proposal.
Well, it was mostly Pepperdine's responsibility to assemble it, but we added materials.
Got it.
You know, it's really Snowden 3 years. It's amazing that. Keith, do you remember what we added to it? I know we used you and Karen Stafford as experts for this project. I don't remember. I do think that we had some short descriptions of people who would be involved with the project. You know, what they do on the daily.
Yes. But yeah, it was mainly they wrote the bulk of it, and
we just supplemented.
Yeah, they would know more of what those materials were. I've done other grants submitted, but you talk about having all this material ready when you write a grant. Does that really happen?
Well, I think this is one of those things where it's like, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. But it is hard to stay ready because so many things change. So I think often organizations end up using a grant proposal as the impetus to pull together a lot of things that they maybe should have had in the past. I mean, that was certainly the case with in my experience with the Association of Moving Image Archivists. We really, the first round of trying for the grants, and I'll be honest, we didn't get it the first time. We applied for it a second time before we actually got the funding, but we learned a lot through that process. We really did think of that grant writing process as being an investment in our organization, and not necessarily time wasted because we didn't get the grant, but time spent on something that did help us. One thing that we noticed was that the grant asked us to have a digital preservation plan or describe what we were going to do with digital resources that we were creating. And there was a host of them. So we were talking about having weekly webinars with the Pathways Fellows that we would be recording and making available as professional development resources. And those are digital assets. And so we were asked as part of the grant guidelines, if you are creating digital assets as part of this project, what's your plan for preserving them? And we realized that as an organization, we had a ton of digital assets, none of which we were really preserving. So it was a real wake-up call to us. And so, yeah, that leads into a question that was asked in the chat by one of our contributors. Does it count if I was asked to contribute to a grant in the past and I felt completely unprepared to do that? Erin, I'd love to invite you to share what your experience was there with whatever degree of specificity you feel comfortable doing, and maybe give us a sense of what might you wanted to have had, or what might have helped you feel prepared to be part of that grant.
Sure, yeah. I was working at an organization that had like a new library director who was sort of like initiating all of these like grant projects in the hope that just like one of them would work out. And I think we submitted a couple grant proposals, maybe two at the same time, and I was asked to contribute to the like financial section of one of them. And I just was like, I'm not the person that should be doing that. Yeah, so I did a lot of research. I made it work. I did my best, but I think it sort of occurred to me that grants are best written by people who, it's a sort of like, best written by people who have done it before, or who sort of know the landscape, or who know what to expect, which isn't to say that like you can't write a grant from scratch, like if you've never done it before, but just that there's a lot of preparatory work, I think, that needs to happen before you can jump into that.
Yes, I agree. I think, they say if you're buying a house, the way to learn to buy a house is buy a house and then buy another house. Having not done either of them, that seems really daunting. And I think that what you've just said about doing a lot of research, reaching out, and the best people to do this work are people who are knowledgeable about it. The question is, how do you get that experience or that knowledge if you haven't already done it? So I think the best recommendation I have for somebody who's writing a grant for the first time or about to is have these conversations, reach out to peer institutions, ask the program officer. What many people don't realize is that grant programs, they want to make sure that your project is successful. It's not cheating, and it's not undue influence if you reach out to the grant program officer, attend information sessions, and have direct contact with the program officer. Say, we're thinking about applying for this grant. We've never applied for a grant before. We've never applied for a grant with your organization before. Here's what we're thinking about asking money for. Can you put me in touch with a previous recipient who has had a similar project that I could talk to about their experiences? Could you share a sample application that is similar to the project we're proposing? Is this even a good fit, or am I barking up the wrong tree? Sometimes the program officer can really help save you a lot of time by clarifying expectations that are not explicit in the program guidelines or the grant writing instructions. They can put you in touch with people who can be sort of by extension, they can be the people who know what they're doing, and they can help you avoid the pitfalls. And yeah, as Keith has pointed out here in the chat, it gets easier after the first one you get. You learn lessons from each grant. So a final thought that I would add about grant proposals is that you think of them as projects that aren't finished when you hand in the final project report to the funder. They're projects that are finished when you have had an internal meeting to discuss, how did that go? What did we learn from this? What are we going to do differently next time? Have a little like postmortem. I don't love that term because it implies that things are dead. I think it's a living thing. It's about like, we want to move forward from this. So I think it's a future vivum rather than a postmortem. I don't know, ante vivum. I don't know if there's a Latin term that applies, but so that's really important to think about as well. A wrap-up conversation or summary document that says lessons learned, concern that is not just for the funder as part of your project report, but is for your internal use and is a reflective document and can inform strategic planning, which we'll be talking about after the break.